Hello, my name is Ed Hughes. I'm a professor in the School of Media, Arts and Humanities at the University of Sussex. I'm speaking as one of the organisers of the 2021 Sussex Festival of Ideas, led by our artistic director, Professor Mary Krell. I'm delighted to be welcoming you to this special event with Professor Ivor Gaber in conversation with Clive Myrie. This brilliant event is part of the launch day of the School of Media, Arts and Humanities inaugural Sussex Festival of Ideas. The main Festival of Ideas runs from the 9th to the 12th of June, and the website has gone live today with full details of all our events, and that's at sussexfestivalofideas.co.uk. In our session this afternoon, Clive will begin by reflecting on his work. Later in the session, there'll be an opportunity to put some questions, so do have a think about the questions you'd like to pose to Clive at that point. Clive Myrie graduated from Sussex in law in 1985 and has had a stellar career since then in journalism and broadcast, and so it's going to be really exciting to hear him reflect on that. He was recently named both presenter and reporter of the year at the Royal Television Society's TV Journalism Awards ceremony. I'm delighted that Clive Myrie will be in conversation with my distinguished colleague, Ivor Gaber, who is Sussex University's Professor of Political Journalism, as well as an Emeritus Professor of Broadcast Journalism at Goldsmiths. I'm now handing over to Ivor, who will chair the session.
Thanks very much, Ed. And let me begin by welcoming Clive. Welcome, Clive. Thank you very much for joining us. Sort of welcome back. Hi, because you're an old boy, and also you're an honorary degree holder. So It's really nice of you to be here. So formal thanks and all that. But let's start our conversation if we can. Let me just tell people, if they don't like the live transcript they're seeing, there's a little button, by the way, at the bottom that says CC, and you can click on that and you can get rid of it. Let's begin where we are. Well, even further back, early life. How did you end up at Sussex back then, Clive?
Good question. I'm trying to think back now. It had the degree that I wanted. But interestingly, I always wanted to be a journalist. But I felt that I needed a degree that I could fall back on and get a decent job, frankly, if the journalism didn't work out. And what was brilliant about Sussex in those days was the interdisciplinary nature of the courses, majors and minors, the American system. So I could major in law, but I could minor, as it were, in the humanities, which is I think a pretty decent background for any journalist. So it combined the two. It was by the sea, the weather was always lovely, and it was a fantastic campus atmosphere. It had everything as far as I was concerned. So that's how I ended up at Sussex, and I loved every minute of it. It's the friends that I made at Sussex are the ones who are my dearest friends now. One of them is actually a professor at the university, it's a place that I'm very, very fond of, and yeah, I love it. I love it.
But a long way from where you grew up in Bolton, just very briefly, your early life, it wasn't the sort of environment where people naturally thought about going to a brand new campus in a new university in the south of England, was it?
I suppose not. I mean, perhaps at that time, students might have stayed relatively close, maybe gone to Manchester University or Liverpool, which also had really good law degree courses as well. I mean, I actually applied to East Anglia as well as Sussex.
And family background, you must have been, to use that cliche, were you the first in your family? Your mother and father were from a relatively modest background, weren't they?
Yes. I mean, they were new immigrants to the country in the early 60s. They're the generation after the Windrush generation. But the whole point of coming to the UK was for their offspring to go to university. I mean, that was the point. So, I mean, I wasn't the first person in my family to go to university. My older sister went to the University of Wales. So that was the mission statement on traveling 6,000 miles to Bolton. That was to get us all to colleges. And luckily that worked out.
So when you were at Sussex, you said even before you came here, you had a passion for journalism. Where did that passion come from?
It came very early in my life, relatively early in my life, around about 6 or 7. I basically would turn on the television and I saw a guy on the TV who looked like me, a black man. And he was in a newsroom, I later found out, and he was reading the news. And his name was Trevor McDonald. And he seemed to be in one country doing some story, and then he'd be talking about another country. And it just all seemed very exciting and very interesting. But the main thing was he looked like me. And I thought, well, it's interesting that he's on this little box, this little TV in the corner. And he looks like me, and he's doing something that looks quite interesting. What's all that about? And then a little bit later on in my life, I got a paper round, and I got into the whole culture of news, reading the newspapers that I was delivering, and understood that these papers and that television with that man on it were a window on a whole different world outside Bolton. And that was a world that I wanted to get to know and what was very, very interested in. So I wanted to be a journalist from probably 8, 9, 10, 11, something like that. Yeah.
So how did you pursue that interest once you were here at Sussex?
Yeah, I mean, I got to Sussex, and as I say, I was studying law, but I minored in American studies in NGAM. And the local campus station was called Radio Falmer. And I had a show on there playing records and stuff, and wrote little sort of articles for the local free sheet magazine called The Informer, I think it was called, and sort of got into things like that way. But Sussex had a show that were called Turn It Up, which was linked through to BBC Radio Brighton, I think it was in those days. So some of the students from Sussex, they were seconded to this BBC radio program to do features on, student life and bands that were visiting, and, issues relevant to the local student population. And that's how I made a link with the BBC, and then applied to the BBC after that to get on one of their training schemes, and was lucky to get on. So I sort of, I did various sort of media related things while I was at Sussex studying for the degree.
You had some distinguished colleagues who were to be distinguished. You weren't the only person who made it from Sussex at that time, were you? Yeah.
I was on Turn It Up, which was the name of that program, with Joe Wiley. And Mark Coles, who is a presenter on the BBC World Service and used to be a presenter on the Today programme. So it was a good sort of laboratory for sort of young media talent, some of whom have gone on to do really good things. So it was a great start for all of us, actually, a really good start.
And you just magically stepped into a job at the BBC, or was it a bit more complicated than that?
You know what? It feels as if it was a magical, mystical, majestical situation, because you're doing little things for Turn It Up, the show. You're writing for the local magazines and stuff, and you're hoping that the work that you do gets noticed. So you apply to I applied to various postgrad journalism courses, and I was rejected pretty much wholesale for all of them. Radio Liverpool, Radio Leicester, WM in the Midlands, I remember applying to, and all of them were saying, look, you need to get on a postgrad training course. That's what they were all telling me. You need to do a course. And it was then that I started looking at the London College of Printing course, and the Cardiff University course, and the one in Falmouth as well in Cornwall.
I should point out we hadn't yet started our postgraduate course at Sussex.
Sussex hadn't started yet, and in fact there were only probably about 5 or 6 nationwide. I think the first university journalism course was Bristol, if I remember rightly. And that was in the late 80s, early 90s. So there weren't that many options, but all of those options meant that I had to pay. And I'm a penniless student. The one thing about the BBC calls was that they paid you. They didn't pay you that much, but they paid you. So that's why that was at the top of my list when I applied. And I was so lucky that I got on it. But it was the background in doing stuff in local radio, doing stuff on Radio Falmer, doing a little bit of writing in Sussex. All that suggested to those people recruiting at the BBC that, you know, this guy clearly wants it. He's working he's working to try and get towards his goal. And there was an enthusiasm there, and it seemed to come through at the interview. So I was lucky.
And what was your first job?
My first job was at Radio Bristol, and I was one of the general reporters. We went on secondments to different radio stations. I was sent to Radio Kent for about 6 weeks, and then I went to Radio Shropshire up in Telford for another 6 weeks. And in between those two, I went to Radio Bristol, and I just loved it. Fell in love with the city. Great news patch, busy, really interesting, wonderful architecture, great history, all that kind of stuff. Loved it. And they actually offered me a job there and then on the spot after the 6 week secondment. But my bosses in London at the BBC said, no, you've got to finish all the courses, then you can go. So I went back, did my secondment to Radio Shropshire, finished the course, and then I walked straight into the job in Bristol. So again, I was really lucky, really lucky.
And so how long did you spend, that was it, BBC forever, or did you then start looking around for other opportunities?
Really, really interesting, actually. At the start of your career, you're sort of, I mean, first of all, you've got into the BBC, which is like the sort of holy grail of broadcasting. And you're thinking, wow, this is amazing. But then you sort of, you know, you're at the start of your career and you don't want to sort of limit yourself. And I started sort of casting around, wondering. I particularly wanted to get into network news as well. I was obviously in local radio in Bristol. And one of the most straightforward ways was to actually leave the BBC and go to independent radio news, IRN. And it also gave me an opportunity to see what life was like on the other side of the wall, as it were. So I left the BBC. And at that time, this is 1989, 1990, everyone thought I was completely bonkers. No one left the BBC to go and work for independent radio. No one did that. Or even to go to ITN. You know, that was just a weird thing to do. But I did it, and I'm so glad I did it, because I was working just off Fleet Street. I got a little bit of a taste of the tail end of that whole, you know, Fleet Street era, which was wonderful. Most of the newspapers were beginning to leave, but there was still a bit of a buzz there. So I had a taste of that. And it meant that I could do national and international news. I went to Northern Ireland for the first time, covered the fall of the Ceausescus in Romania. You know, I got opportunities that I wouldn't have got at that stage in my career at the BBC. So I was really glad I did that. But then I wanted to get into television, and going back to Bristol to do television seemed the best way to do that.
So that was the start of your BBC TV news career. Tell us how that went, and how did you I know your ambition was to be a foreign reporter. How did you move from just rejoining from independent radio news to getting your first foreign assignment?
Well, again, I felt that it was important to sort of learn the craft of writing and telling a story pictorially through pictures, through moving pictures, you know, in the region, so that if I got the opportunity to go to London, I would have made all my mistakes far away. And I wouldn't sort of potentially come a cropper in London. So Bristol was brilliant for that, not just in television actually, but in radio as well. And I would suggest this to all those students who are thinking of getting into journalism, you know, try to learn the craft from the bottom up. Don't think you want to become a presenter, you know, straight away and, you know, end up presenting Newsnight or whatever, 10 o'clock news or whatever. You know, you need to learn the craft. And I felt I wanted to do that and do that in a city that I loved. And in a newsroom that was going to be helpful, but also warm and instructive in me learning how to produce good television. So I was there for 18 months, and then of course I got itchy feet. I was in the newsroom. I remember it very clearly, in the newsroom, looking up at the screen, and Kate Adie is in Tiananmen Square. I'm thinking, I want to be in Tiananmen Square, but how the hell do I get to Tiananmen Square from here? And I just sent off tapes of my work in local TV to the newsroom in London. And not that long afterwards, actually, I got a reply from a guy called Chris Kramer, who was the head of news gathering at the BBC. And he said, look, I like the tape, come and do some weekend shifts. And that was it. Did some weekend shifts. I'd get into my, little car, drive up to London on a Friday night, having done a shift in the Bristol newsroom on the Friday evening, done the evening program, get in the car, drive up, get to Television Centre, which is where TV News was based in those days. And I would do a weekend shift, Saturday and Sunday, get on the TV, which was fantastic, network news, and then drive back to Bristol Sunday night to do a shift on Monday.
But it was foreign reporting you really wanted to do.
Yeah.
How did you get your first assignment?
Yeah, foreign reporting was what I wanted to do. Did those shifts over a period of months, and I didn't fall off air. It wasn't a big disaster. Chris Kramer said, come to London permanently. So packed up everything, moved to London, did work for 18 months or so, learning really this how the newsroom works and doing national stories. And then I got a secondment to the Today program. And on that program, I came up with a couple of ideas. And was sent off to do them. And the TV news editor said, why did you do those stories just for the Today program? You could have done them for TV too. The next idea you have, we want you to do it for television. So I came up with an idea to go to Liberia, which had just come out of a brutal civil war. I got good access to one of the main warlords, and I told the story on television, and it wasn't a disaster. It worked out quite nicely. So I got more trips, and that you've got to be determined. Come up with ideas at the beginning of your career to show people that you really want this, and that's what I was doing. Luckily, and it worked out.
Okay, let's have a look at the young Clive Myrie making his mark in the world of foreign reporting from Liberia. It's chilling.
I look so young. Those were
unchanged to me. It's a chilling report in two ways. One is those child soldiers, but also Charles Taylor sitting there saying, "Oh, freedom comes at a cost." How do you feel? Charles Taylor is now sitting in a British prison, I think. Do you get some sort of sense of satisfaction that you played a small part in bringing his crimes to light?
Yeah, the bloke is serving at Her Majesty's pleasure, actually the International Criminal Court's pleasure I think it's in Durham or somewhere in the Northeast. He's in jail. Look, at that particular moment in time, he was part of the peace talks. So he was in a position to help stabilize the country and bring peace to, after 4 odd years of really brutal civil war, as I say, involving child soldiers. So, you have to sort of sit around the negotiating table, even if it's with the devil, in order to sort of calm things down and to get some kind of peace deal sorted out. If you're Martin McGuinness, you're going to talk to the other side, as it were, and the unionist side, and Dr. Ian Paisley. You've got to sit down and negotiate. His problem was that he decided that he was going to get involved in other conflicts in the region and get involved in dealing with and processing blood diamonds. And he launched another civil war regionally and ended up going to jail. So, I mean, I gave him an opportunity to explain himself and an opportunity to get across his point of view as these peace talks neared. But he's a thoroughly despicable human being, and that kind of access was very rare to him, and I was lucky to get it. Fearful
at all? You didn't feel any sense that you might say the wrong thing, ask the wrong question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And his main bodyguard must have been about 7 feet tall. His shoulder span must have been about, I don't know, 4 feet. I mean, he was enormous. And in fact, to fly into the country, you had to, because there was still a bit of shelling going on from time to time, you had to do what's called a corkscrew landing. So the plane didn't just sort of come in like that. It sort of corkscrewed down in order to avoid any incoming fire. I mean, it was scary getting in there. And as I said at the beginning of the report, you know, it's very few people actually did make that journey, because
and still do, and still it's not a hugely reported part of the world.
Exactly.
But let's move on from there. So from that report, your first report, what was the next move in your career?
So from then, I suppose it was an attempt by me to consolidate, hopefully, a position in foreign reporting. I mean, at that stage in my life and in the life of the BBC, frankly, you know, there was a fixed idea of what a foreign correspondent looked like, and tended to be male, tended to be white, and tended to be public school, Oxbridge. So there weren't many women foreign correspondents at that time. I mean, I can point to Kate Adie, who just got on the scene, 89, 90. A little bit earlier with the Iranian embassy siege, but obviously with Tiananmen Square after that. Diana Goodman was the BBC's correspondent in Moscow, I think. Bridget Kendall had only just started reporting as well. These are all people that, you know, those watching this Zoom chat probably have never heard of, but they were instrumental in putting women reporters, particularly in foreign assignments, on the map and making them known. And there were very few Black people. I mean, I can't think of any, actually, now, thinking about it, doing foreign news. So I needed to try to cement that position and come up with more ideas to go abroad. And hopefully at some point get a posting to a faraway field. And I did more stories. I was in Croatia, covering the war, Angola, I covered the war there as well, and eventually did enough to get a posting to Tokyo. And I was based in Tokyo for 2 years.
Was that an odd experience? I mean, there's not that many Black people in Japan, and it's said to be an insular society. Did you feel other?
No, not at all. Not at all. And what I will always be grateful to the BBC for is listening to me and my idea of where I felt my career should be going. And, you know, as a young Black reporter, I did not want my career I did not want my color to define my career. I didn't want to be seen as a Black journalist. I wanted to be a journalist who just happened to be Black. And I made that clear to my bosses, that I didn't necessarily want to be going down to Brixton every day covering riots. I didn't necessarily want to be going to Notting Hill every day covering, you know, the Notting Hill Carnival. Now, this is insecurity on my part, because I'm thinking, I don't want people out there thinking, oh, he's only been sent to this story because he's a Black guy. Oh, he's only... So there's an insecurity on my part, but also, as I say, I didn't want color to define my career. And me be pigeonholed just as I'm starting out on this great journey. So I said to my boss, I said, look, you know, I don't want to be sort of labeled as the Black reporter. And they got that, which is brilliant. They really did. So they said, okay, we're going to send you to the whitest place on earth, Japan. And I went there, and it was absolutely fantastic. And I've got great friends there. I go back when I can, although it's been a few years since I was last there. I had a wonderful, wonderful time. And I hope it helped cement in the public's mind the idea that I wasn't a Black reporter. I just happened to be a reporter. And hopefully they won't see my color first. They'll hear what I've got to say and go beyond the exterior of my visage. But on a personal level, I mean, it's interesting. Japan actually has quite a deep history and link to African-American culture through the occupation of the United States Army at the end of the Second World War. So the Japanese love their jazz, they love their baseball, they are obsessed with everything American. And that includes Black American culture. And I've been to some of the best jazz clubs in the world in Tokyo. So there you go. I had a great time. Loved it.
You said you didn't want to be defined by your color, but to some extent, weren't your audiences defining you? I'm thinking back many years ago when I was a lowly journalist at ITN, and if Trevor McDonald was presenting the news, then the newsroom phones used to ring hot with racists saying, "Get that person off the screen." Did you not encounter that sort of hostility in the early career?
Not to begin with, not very often. I mean, yeah, there'd be the odd comment as well. In those days, you didn't have Twitter, and you know, email was functioning, but that access that the public had to you as a figure on the television was not as all-pervasive and numerous as it is now. You might get the odd bit of mail, the odd letter saying, you know, we don't want to see people like you on the TV, but it was nothing that bothered me particularly. And in fact, to be honest with you, to this day, the vast majority of the postbag is actually positive. Very, very positive. I mean, most recently, I mean, I have had, you know, death threats from one particular person. But that kind of thing is very, very rare, to be honest with you. And I certainly would not want to label the great British viewing public as racist. It is not at all. The vast majority are very happy to see diversity on their screens. And that's not just in terms of color. You know, that's LGBTQ, that is disabilities, and that's gender as well. And that's a good place that we're all in, I think.
Just to dwell on this issue for a moment, because it's going to take us into the next clip. Although you said you didn't want to be known as a black journalist, you wanted to be a journalist who happened to be black, it couldn't have been a disadvantage, let's say, in getting you your assignment to report on the election of the first black president. Was that very emotional? Was that very emotional for you?
Yeah, it was a very powerful moment. I mean, we're talking about now from the report from that first TV foreign report for the BBC. So I'd done foreign reporting in radio for Radio 4 and the Today programme from that 1995 Liberia piece to 2008. So that's a good span of years. And in that time, I'd matured, got a level of self-confidence, and got to the point where I was the first person putting my hand up saying, I want to do stories that are involving black people, because I hope that by then the public are not seeing a black person, they're just seeing a reporter. And obviously, you know, the election of the first black president was something, and the first black person to get on, you know, the ticket of a major party in the United States after the nominations was something that I wanted to be part of. And I was based in Brussels at the time. And I just kept badgering the foreign editor saying, look, I know I'm in Brussels, but I need to cover the story. I need to cover the story. And it took a while, actually, Ivor. It took a while to convince them, but it worked. And I covered the election itself. I was in Atlanta, in Morehouse College, the sort of black Oxbridge, I suppose you could say. Martin Luther King went to Morehouse, Samuel L. Jackson, Spike Lee, they all studied there. I was in the main hall covering the count, and they had big screens up with all the TV networks and their election coverage, and alumni were there and current faculty and students and so on. And the election was called. Obama had won. Everyone around me was in tears. And I had to go live on this special election program with Mr. Dimbleby. And he asked me to just sum up the mood. And I said, it's incredible, you know, all these people seeing first African-American, at the very top of the executive branch. This is just wonderful, blah, blah, blah. And then in the middle of it, at the end of it, I said, you know, and I have to say, David, for me as a black reporter to be here at this moment in time, in this place, is a privilege. And he said, Clive, thank you very much indeed. And went off to something else. And I thought, oh no, I've crossed the line. I'd talked about myself. I'd injected myself into the story. oh no. And then I turned around and I saw the correspondent for ABC News. And he was broadcasting live to probably about 30 million people, probably more actually, probably a hell of a lot more. And he was in tears, live. Tears were streaming down his face, and he was doing a live interview on American television. And I thought to myself, I haven't crossed any line at all, no line whatsoever. And indeed, the reviews of the BBC's coverage pointed to that little injection of myself into the coverage, and said it was a powerful moment.
It would have been bizarre to have ignored it in one sense, but you weren't there just for the election. You were lucky enough, if that's the right word, or the appropriate reporter, you were back there for the inauguration a few months later. Let's just see your report of the inauguration of America's first Black president. That's a very powerful piece and a powerful historical reminder. Can I just give a reminder to our viewers, if you're watching this live, we can't do it once it's recorded, but you're encouraged to ask any questions. If you put them in the Q&A or the chat, I will pass them on to Clive. Unfortunately, if you're watching it on YouTube recorded, we ain't there anymore. But just go back to that piece, Clive, just watching it now, still looking young. Those are very powerful images from Little Rock going back, that it wasn't, we almost take the election of Obama for granted, but it was a tough old road to get there, wasn't it?
No, it
and
was.
It's still.
Yeah, and it still is. I mean, we had the court decision on the killing of George Floyd and the murder conviction of Derek Chauvin. Just a week ago, something like that. I mean, what was interesting about that, I mean, I'd been the Los Angeles correspondent for 4 years at the end of the 90s, then a Washington correspondent. Then I ended up in Asia, Paris, Brussels, and ended up flying from Brussels to cover the Obama election. So I covered a lot of America, and I'd done stories when I was in Los Angeles and Washington on states prosecuting former members of the KKK, for historic abuses. So I'd seen, a little bit of this journey that America had made from the sort of, by proxy, from the sort of 50s and 60s and the civil rights movement through to this moment with Obama's election and inauguration. So it was a powerful personal journey for me as well, having covered some of the historical abuses of African Americans. I remember I did a piece on a man who survived a lynching. I think the rope snapped or something. And I interviewed him in 2004, 2005, I think. So 5 years before Obama's election. So I've been on this journey, as I say, by proxy, but I've been on this journey as well. So it was amazing for me to be in Washington at that moment when Obama was elected. But make no mistake, Obama was indicative of America's racial crisis. He was not the symbol of the suggestion that that crisis was over. He was indicative of it. He was lucky that he managed to get up. There are millions of African Americans, Latinos as well, minorities who are having problems.
But in the euphoria of Obama's election and then re-election, you could not have imagined that the racial crisis, which is, I think, the correct word, we would be facing in America 10 years or so later. It does seem like we've gone backwards, or maybe, as you said, Obama didn't represent anything more than a symbolic victory.
Yeah, I think that's essentially it. The structures of American society, the fact that the South at the end of the Civil War never really paid the price that it needed to pay in order to acknowledge the sins of slavery. That did not happen. I mean, literally within a matter, you had an institution, slavery, that had been in place since the 16th century in America, 16th, 17th century, going through to the mid-19th century. So for many, many years, you had a civil war that lasted for 4 or 5 years. And then you had a period of Reconstruction that lasted for barely 15, 20 years. There was no way that you were going to be able, in that short amount of time, to overturn the psychological depth of the effect of slavery on the American psyche of the South. The only way to do that would have been through education, possibly through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we saw at the end of apartheid and the years in South Africa. A reckoning needed to take place, and it never happened. It never happened, and as a result, the South never paid the price it needed to. It was allowed to continue to luxuriate in the idea that white people, particularly white men, were superior to Black people. And that mentality feeds right through to this day. And it's the mentality that people like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X were struggling against in the 1960s, 100 years after the end of the Civil War. The bottom line is the South never paid a price. It just didn't do it.
And that could bring us neatly onto Trump. But I want to do a quick swerve still on the racial issue that Robert Yates is asking. 27 years, yesterday was Africa Freedom Day, 27 years on from the end of apartheid. How do you reflect on the current situation there in South Africa?
I think the Mandela years were an attempt, obviously, to try to improve the conditions of tens of millions of Black Africans who'd been subjugated and were treated as separate and second-class citizens for such a long time. But it was always going to be difficult to raise the standard of living and to raise and to achieve the expectations and hopes of what 80% of the population in such a short space of time. And primarily what Mandela was hoping to do was to try to sort of bind the wounds and salve the injuries that were caused to the psychology of South Africa because of the apartheid years. I think he did that to a degree. There was an element of reconciliation between white and Black, and I think that worked pretty well. But after a while, I think Black Africans were then asking themselves, okay, we're in the ascendancy here politically. Why is that not translating to me economically? And so you saw a movement towards trying to take back white-owned farms, for instance, to try to even up the economic divide in the country. You saw a move towards affirmative action in the country as well. But structural flaws within South Africa, and frankly, useless presidents. I'm primarily pointing the finger at Mr. Zuma on this, meant that there's a level of arrested development economically in South Africa, and it's having trouble getting over that. And I think that is now beginning to feed into a worsening in race relations. I mean, I was last in South Africa for the funeral of Nelson Mandela. And there was obviously a huge outpouring of love for him, grief also, but reflection. What has the end of apartheid, 8-9 years previous to that, no, 15, 16 years previous to that, what has that brought the Black population? Has that improved? Has my life really improved in relation to this? And I think it's highly likely that the ANC, Mandela's party, they could well end up in a position where they're losing a lot of support in the next election, and possibly even end up losing power, which I think would be an amazing turn of events.
Talking of amazing turn of events, I'm struck, as you must have been, and I'd like you to reflect on it, the contrast between, if you like, the halcyon days of Obama. They weren't quite halcyon, but to suddenly America, which I know you've taken a particular interest in going back to your days at Sussex, apart from working there, to, let me betray a little bit of political prejudice here, the nightmare 4 years of Trump. What a shocking contrast. How do you explain that?
Many people have tried to explain this in books and pamphlets and articles. I mean, it absolutely was a response by a vocal minority of white America, and there's no question about that. There are many white Americans who voted for Obama and voted twice, who ended up voting for Trump, and I wouldn't necessarily class them as white supremacists because they voted for Obama. But Americans are very pragmatic. when it comes to elections. Most populations are, but Americans are particularly. And it may be that they don't like the look of a black guy, but if there's the suggestion that he might help them economically, they're going to vote for him. And I think Trump, politically gifted in being so sociopathic that he's willing to tell people what they want to hear, rather than what he genuinely believes might be the best thing for America, because he's too busy worried about what's the best thing for him. He's willing to feed on that latent racism in order to get power. And he did that very, very successfully. And the fact of the matter is, the American working class have been going backwards since the 1970s. And that is as a result of a whole host of things: offshoring, China, the rise of China economically, but also, I think, a realization on the part of many on the right that they can keep the power and the money that they have within society by keeping the working class on their side, and by pointing up certain things within society that are hot button issues for the working class, even though it may be ultimately against their own interests to vote for the Republican side in America. They still do. So Republicans will point to guns, they will point to immigration, and they will point to, the welfare state, low taxes, even though all these things are frankly detrimental to ordinary working people. And it's been incredibly successful for Republicans. And as a result, that is why I think you've got this shift diametrically opposed to the ideals and impulses of Obama. Ended up getting someone like Donald Trump, the very antithesis of what these working class people thought they wanted, the embodiment of everything that they actually believe is wrong with America. They ended up putting their faith in this charlatan. And the last 3.5 years, we've seen the result of that, whether it's in the economic performance, one of the worst of the last 6 to 7 presidents, to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans as a result of the bungling mishandling of the coronavirus epidemic.
Well, we'll come to that in a moment. Just before we do, I just want to put to you a question that Robbie Hughes has asked, which is how important, on the subject of America, how important is it for we in this country to engage in US politics and civil rights issues? How much do you think American issues are linked to our own?
So really, really good question. All foreign policy roads lead to Washington. It is the preeminent power. Whatever America does influences us. We're desperately trying to get a trade deal with them now, having left the European Union. America is the senior partner in NATO, to which we are a part. It is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. It dominates the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. I mean, it is an enormous center of power. And as a result, it's best for us to be on the right side of it than on the wrong side of it. And we're having to sort of make that decision now in a much more concerted way with the rise of China. And we saw the foreign policy initiatives of people like David Cameron and George Osborne pivoting more towards Asia, away from the United States, or at least making more of an effort to engage with the Chinese because of its growing economic might. And we're having to reflect on whether or not that was the right thing to do in terms of America's sort of China's growing might within the South China Sea, its attempts to influence elections around the world, and most obviously its treatment of the Tibetan minority, and most recently the Uyghurs. So the relationship with America has to be fulsome. It has to be productive. But we've got to look around the world as well at those powers that are rising. And I think that's a conundrum that we're going to have to wrestle with over the next decade or so. But no, whatever happens in America is critical to the well-being of ordinary Britons, and we've got to be on top of that.
You mentioned a moment ago the fact that Trump's handling of coronavirus played an important role in his re-election, in his defeat, in his defeat.
Lost.
You were there and reporting on both the impact of the coronavirus on particularly how it affected minorities. In this report, you went to look at how it affected the Navajo Nation. But the contrast in this report with the Trump rally that followed it is quite stark. So let's just start off with Clive, with some members of the Navajo Nation and who are badly affected by COVID. You've spoken, actually, before I ask this question, let me say we've got lots of questions coming in, but we've got another, at the most half an hour. So do ask your questions and I will try and get to them all. We'll come on to some about journalism that have come in, but I just want to dwell on that report, Clive, because it particularly that interview with the Trump supporters, it relates to what you said in a recent distinguished lecture you gave in memory of the great journalist Harry Evans about the toxic media environment. It's clear it was a major factor in the States. Will it be a major factor here, or do we have more robust mechanisms for dealing with that toxicity?
Yeah, I think we have tougher guardrails here. America used to have them too. I mean, it's interesting at the beginning in the middle of that piece, when after I introduced the rally and I go into the home of Chris and Sarah, wonderful people, by the way, you could see the TV on the side as we walked past. It was on Fox News, 24-hour Fox News. Pretty much the home we went into, they had on Fox News. They get their news from a single source, or at least they're all right-wing sources. There is no diversity there. And to a degree, it's the same on the left as well. They're watching MSNBC, they're watching CNN, and that polarization is there because the law allows it. You know, you can, as a media owner, set up a television station and you can pump out whatever you like. As long as it doesn't race bait, as long as it stays within the law, you can say whatever you like. You can pump out as much propaganda for the right or for the left, whatever you like. We do not have that. That is not allowed in Britain. We have Ofcom, we have rules from the regulator, which is Ofcom, that says that you've got to have balanced news coverage. Both sides have to be given equal weight so that the public can make up their own minds about a particular story or a particular issue. You don't have that in America. And in the silo culture in which we live in, a fractured media landscape where you can cherry pick the media that you want. You can just have the Facebook feed that gives you all right-wing stuff, the Facebook feed that gives you all left-wing stuff. If you're in a country where the TV is the same, why would you bother listening to the other side? You wouldn't bother. And that is what America is like. But here in Britain, thankfully, we have rules. And it used to be the case in America that they had rules too. They got rid of them in the 1980s. And they got rid of them because right-wing backers was waiting for those rules to disappear so that they could set up right-wing radio stations that could mainline right-wing propaganda right into the veins of voters. And the left has done a similar sort of thing, but with less success. So I am much more sanguine about the media landscape, the future media landscape in this country. Social media is a different thing, the digital space is difficult to police. And I think it's incumbent on the tech companies themselves to be much more robust in dealing with propaganda, in dealing with crazy conspiracy theories and so on. But when it comes to mainstream media and mainstream television, we've got rules here that I hope means that we're not going to go down the toxic road that America has stumbled down for several years now.
Well, I'll come back to this country, and particularly the BBC, in a moment, but the remarks you make relate to a question Kathy Franklin's asked. She says, despite or because of these 4 years of negativity, the racism of Trump, and the toxic media, do you see the USA being able to build bridges between the extremes in its population? Is there a way forward for America beyond the current situation?
I think there is a way forward. It is more difficult because of the media landscape that I've outlined, but I think, you know, direction comes from the top. And I think by anyone's estimation, the last 4 years haven't been the greatest. In the minds of some eminent historians who log these things, Donald Trump has been the most divisive president since the middle of the 19th century, and quite possibly the worst president the country has ever had, because he actively sought to divide the nation in a way that every other chief executive, bar some of those, as I say, during the Civil War, who wanted to keep the Union together. And if you look at the top ranks of American presidents, it's Washington, it's FDR, it's Lincoln, people who wanted to bind the Union together and keep it together. And it's the ones who are at the bottom of the pecking order who are the ones who tried to tear it apart, which is why Donald Trump is at the very bottom. Now, if you've got leadership at the top that is different to that, then hopefully you might get different outcomes. And someone like Joe Biden served in the Senate for many, many years, vice president for 8 years. And now he's president. He knows the ropes. He knows Congress. He knows how to get deals done. He knows how to cooperate with the other side. And that is something that might be the beginning, the nucleus, the seed of a reconciliation between America's warring political factions. But it's going to be difficult because of that toxic media climate that exists. But if anyone can do it, it's probably going to be someone like Joe Biden.
Just coming back home, the last, what is now 14 months, we've probably had the biggest journalistic story that any of us have ever worked on since I didn't work on the Second World War, but it's of that magnitude.
Yeah.
How do you think the media generally in this country has performed?
I think you're right to say that it's the biggest, it's probably the biggest story since the Second World War. I mean, more civilians have died as a result of COVID than died in the Second World War. So that shows the scale of it. And what's the latest count? 120,000 people. I think the media has covered it by and large very, very well. I think the beginning of the pandemic found the media trying to sort of find its feet, saw the media trying to find its feet as to how far to go. I mean, it's a national emergency. And as a result, you sort of need to be sort of playing on the right side, as it were. You don't necessarily, perhaps, want to be seen to be criticizing the government too much. The official opposition took that tack and still does to a degree. But at the end of the day, you need to tell the story. You need to be truthful and you need to be honest. And I think as time went on, the media wanted to tell those stories that weren't getting out there, that weren't being officially part of the narrative. The hospitals that were beginning to fall down, the nurses that were breaking down, the health system that was collapsing. Those were stories that parts of the Department for Health and Social Security, didn't really want out there. They didn't want pictures of triage tents with patients in football fields, which was what we were seeing in Italy. They didn't want that being revealed in this country. And that made it difficult to get to the truth at the very beginning. But I think eventually, journalists managed to do that and tell the real story of what was going on. And I think those pictures and the writing, it actually helped inform the nation to understand that maybe there's a point to a lockdown. Maybe there's a point to them not being able to do what they want to do or have the freedoms that they want because so many people are dying. It may not be touching you personally, health-wise, but it's touching a hell of a lot of other people. And I think it's to the credit of British journalism that we did eventually manage to get those stories out.
And eventually, well, not eventually, but you did a series of major reports from the London Hospital in East End of London, which was one of the hospitals that really caught the COVID crisis full on. What's the background? You're not a medical reporter. What's the background to foreign reporter Clive Myrie turning up at the London Hospital?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'd done a series of reports on knife crime at the hospital, so I knew a few of the medical staff. Amazing, dedicated, selfless people, and the pandemic broke, and I thought, well, it'd be good to go back to that hospital and talk to some of the staff about how they're coping. And as a result, try to get beneath the headlines, the medical headlines of this crisis. Hugh Pym, Fergus Walsh, we have incredible medical reporters and science reporters at the BBC. And I didn't want to step on their toes or tell the same story that they were telling. I wanted the human dimension to this crisis. How are our individual doctors and nurses coping? How is the NHS coping? And how are the families around which this hospital, the area that they live and that the hospital serves, how are they coping with this crisis? So going a little bit deeper, and we managed to get access. It took a long time, but we managed to get access and tell some of those powerful stories.
Let's just see an extract from part of one of your reports. With those scenes, shocking as they were, actually pale when you look at the dreadful pictures coming out of India, which is a really stark reminder that we're a long way from the end of this pandemic. However, I just want to address, and I do want to get to most of the questions if I can, but I want to ask you a general question about the BBC and its public perception. Somebody said to me the other day when I was telling them about this interview, oh yeah, Clive Myrie's been a bit of an overnight success really, hasn't he? And I said, yeah, he's only been in the BBC 33 years. Long night. But actually, over those 33 years, the public perceptions of the BBC has changed, not necessarily for the better. Is that fair? Is that fair? Does the BBC get unfairly attacked, or does it need to look at itself and its own editorial standards? Because whether you're going from the left or the right, and I'm not going to go down that hoary old things of, oh, we get criticism from both, it must be okay. But is there something fundamentally going wrong with the BBC, or is it the public perception of it?
There's nothing wrong with continual self-reflection and asking yourself the question, are you getting things right? And the BBC does that. Some actually within the organization think we do that too much. But I think it's good to take a temperature check every now and again. I certainly think that because public tastes and attitudes have developed and have changed, as I was saying earlier, with a much more fractured media landscape, there are many more ways people can consume news and get news, and they can get the news that they want. The idea that the BBC happens to be, or tries to be, sometimes less successfully than others, but tries to be impartial, is not what you want to hear. If you're a Republican and you want to watch Fox News, you come over here, turn on the BBC, you ain't getting, the stuff mainlined straight into your veins that you really want, which is a particular view on certain issues. You're not going to get that from the BBC, and it's the same on the left. So I think while the BBC needs to be self-reflective, I think a lot of the issues concerning the BBC now and public perception of the organization is as a result of the consumer actually changing and wanting something different. The BBC, in trying to give both sides, in trying to give due weight, in trying to have both sides of an argument express their point of view so that the public, according to Ofcom rules, can make up their own mind. That's not necessarily what some people want, especially if they're having to pay for the service. And I think that's a big part of the problem. If you want propaganda and you're having to pay for a service that is not giving you propaganda, you're going to get hacked off. And that's where we are, frankly.
Do you blame social media?
Social media is a big part of it, no question about it. I do think the public has become much more sophisticated in the way that it looks at stories and issues. I think if you are you're someone, and that hopefully is most right-thinking people who believe in diversity and believe in media organizations reflecting the country as it really is, then I think you can get frustrated sometimes that, I don't know, Nigel Farage is on every time or on regularly, or you could get frustrated that, you know, there are certain elements on the left who are getting airtime. I mean, I can see how social media has helped to deepen the divide within society on certain levels. And I think social media has a lot to answer for because it doesn't clean up its own house. But having said that, the BBC is not perfect at all. But there are structures, there are processes that can hopefully, if there's a complaint, or if we understand ourselves, the workers within the BBC, that we're making mistakes, that we can improve. That's not necessarily there for social media. And I think that is a big, big problem.
I want to just now focus a little bit on journalism as a career. There's a question, and I don't know whether his name is from Daniel Brown, who tells me or says that he and you were on at Sussex at the same time in the 80s, and he began his journalistic career like you here. He was very much involved in the student radio station, but mainly on the student newspaper, which was then called Union News, and he then went to work at Radio France International. His paths, he's not sure the paths crossed, but his question, which is an interesting one, is what did you keep? What did you get from your Sussex days, which you feel has impacted on your journalistic career?
I think a sense of, I think for Sussex, for me, Sussex helped keep my sense of wonderment about the world. It didn't make me cynical. Things were always possible at Sussex. You know, I mean, within 2 weeks, I was involved in a rent strike. I'd been there for 2 weeks and I was on strike. There's a sense that if you take the initiative, you can change things, you can make things better, you can make the world better. You can make your own community better. You can make society better if you get up and fight for it. You know, and Sussex, which, you know, is fantastic. And I love this about Sussex. It's still got that sort of, you know, revolutionary zeal. You know, it's got fire in its belly. The students are not going to sit around and just wait for something to happen. They're going to get up and make stuff happen, you know, and I love that about Sussex. And I think that sense of wonderment and the sense that you can change things, possibly in your own little way, I think that has informed my own outlook on life, and I think helped make me, to be honest with you, a better journalist, perhaps. You know, I'm not cynical about the future. I'm not jaded about the future. I understand the future a little bit. I understand the processes that can lead to a particular outcome in the future on some issues. But it doesn't necessarily make me feel that, you know, the world is going to hell in a handcart. And I think that's really important in a journalist, that you don't become just jaded and fed up. And, you know, you see, because I mean, I saw what was going on in that COVID ward, and I saw what was going on in the battlefield in Liberia and Libya and Syria and Angola and Croatia and Bosnia and all the East Timor, all these horrible places, but I still have a positive outlook on life. And I think that's got to try to inform the journalism. I hope that informs my journalism, and I hope that makes me a better person. And I think an element of that came from being at Sussex, actually.
On a much more mundane level, Ollie Devine is asking, do you think people going into journalism need today to have videography and photography skills in addition to journalistic nose, if you like?
I mean, you've got to have as many tools in your toolbox as you can, really, and you know, you potentially will have more to offer if you can do those other things. But it may be that you're just a really good writer, and you can convey the complexity of a story, you know, in words, and you don't need pictures. Obviously, I think if you can take pictures as well, because any written story is going to need pictures along with it. If you can do that as well, more power to your elbow. You know, the more disciplines that you can say that you're involved with and that you can show evidence of, then that's obviously going to make you more attractive to a prospective employer.
Is there one tip? I'm sure there's more than one, but what's your key tip for somebody watching this who wants to go into journalism?
You've got to have determination. You've got to have a thick skin, and you've got to not necessarily take no for an answer. I remember in the 1980s when they used to have advertisements in the Guardian on a Monday, journalist jobs. It was every Monday, I think, most of the journalist jobs were advertised in the Guardian, you know, for all manner of media, television, radio. The BBC ads always had in them for, you know, foreign correspondents. You must have, obviously, be able to, I don't know, speak French or whatever, blah, 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 or know the story, know the politics, da, 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 but you must have stamina. You must have stamina. That was part of the job description. And I think it's important that, you know, you can keep going physically and psychologically, you know, when you're knocked back. It's a competitive industry. Lots of people want to get into it. Some people, for the wrong reasons, they just want to be, you know, think they want to be famous. Other people just want to tell human stories and explain the human experience, which is essentially what journalism is about. And you know, it's lots of people want to be able to do that. So it means that it's the jobs are limited. You know, you're going to get knocked back, but have determination and keep going. I mean, I you know, in my loft are all the rejection letters I had from all those radio stations saying, you know, you need to go on a course, you need to go on a course. And I think about those every now and again. You know,
well, we've got some great postgraduate courses if you want to pop in for a year.
Love to, man. Love to. I need to brush up my who, what, where, and why every now and again. So,
well, actually, yeah. one of the questions was, would you consider being a visiting professor here? That's something that I'm sure you'd consider. We'll put in the. I'll put it to my bosses.
Are you offering me a job, man? Are you offering me a job?
Oh, great. I have to tell you, as a visiting professor, they don't. There's no pay. It's just glory. No pay. It's like an honorary degree. Just let me finish by focusing on why we're here. That sounds like a big metaphysical question, but we're here to celebrate the launch of this new faculty. Just stepping back from the day to day, how important in broad terms are the arts and humanities to the media, to journalism?
I mean, they're vital, I would say. I mean, it's interesting though, in the pandemic, you know, if you've got a background as a statistician or a mathematician or a scientist, if that's what you studied at college and you can write, you're laughing. Certainly through the whole debate over Brexit, if you had an economics degree, I mean, that would have been wonderful. But these are sort of specific stories that come up every now and again. And obviously you can focus on those specialisms, economics correspondent, business correspondent, science correspondent. But by and large, essentially, ultimately, you're just telling stories. You're telling human stories. And the humanities is the study of I don't know, human society. It's the study of culture, you know, and all that is related to that, all the aspects of that. That's essentially what journalism is, but that's what the humanities is as well. So to have that background in just understanding what makes people tick, what makes societies function, you know, why is it certain people do certain things, you know, what is it about human nature that means certain outcomes take place, you know, that I would suggest is fundamental to what it means to be a journalist and fundamental to what it means to tell stories. And I suppose that would be my link between the humanities and the job that I do. A fundamental grounding in wanting to understand the human condition in all its frailties, in all its complexity, and with all its faults. And that's what the humanities does. So, yeah.
Clive, that's a great ending to, I hope, an interesting and fascinating interview. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your clips. Thank you for your enthusiasm for Sussex. And I'm now just going to hand back to my colleague, Ed, to wrap up this section. But thanks again.
Pleasure.
Clive and Ivor, thank you so much for a fascinating and incredibly direct and relevant session. It has been a wonderful insight into your career, Clive, and also detailed and profound reflections on world events that are frequently shocking and always important, and how you've brought the truth to mass audiences in really compelling ways. It's been really brilliant to have had you here as part of the launch of the Sussex Festival of Ideas, which is a new initiative coming out of the School of Media Arts and Humanities, inspiring and challenging. I think it will inspire our staff and students to continue to address the big themes and events affecting human experience on this planet. If I may, before we go, a reminder to everyone that the events of the 2021 Sussex Festival Ideas are now fully live on the website, so do browse them and put 9th to the 12th of June in your diary. Our launch events today are about to conclude with another very special session with the school's student-led podcast, On the Record, featuring the Sussex Chancellor, Sanjeev Bhaskar, and that starts very shortly via the festival website at 5:30. But for now, thank you once again, Clive, and Ivor as well, for a completely brilliant session.